the unforgiving heart of the Arizona Territory, one name was spoken only in hushed, fearful whispers: Kalin Blackwood. They called him the cruel Apache, a man whose ranch was carved from stone and shadow, and whose heart was said to be just as barren. When Elara Vance, penniless and desperate, rode through his gates, seeking work, she expected a monster. She found something far more dangerous: a broken man. This is the story of a woman with nothing left to lose, and a man who had long ago lost everything that mattered. It's a story of how a single gentle hand dared to touch a soul fortified by a decade of stone, and the earth-shattering consequences of healing a heart the world had sworn was better left dead. The dust was a living thing, a fine red powder that coated Elara Vance's tongue, settled in the lines of her face, and clung to her worn-out riding dress. It was the taste of desperation. For 3 days she had ridden towards the jagged peaks of the Dragoon Mountains, chasing a rumor, a last, hopeless chance. The rumor had a name: the Blackwood Ranch, and its owner had a reputation darker than a moonless night. Her father's ranch, the Double V, had been lost to sickness and debt. The cattle withered from a fever that swept through the valley, and the bank run by a man with a smile as cold as a winter creek had been swift and merciless. With her father's cough growing weaker by the day, and the last of their savings dwindling to a handful of coins, Elara had swallowed her pride and done the unthinkable. She was seeking employment from Kalin Blackwood. They called him the Apache behind his back, a cruel moniker, born from his mixed heritage and his even harsher temperament. Stories claimed he was the son of a wealthy rancher and a Chiricahua woman, a man who belonged to neither world and was scorned by both. They said he'd won his land in a bloody card game and held it with an iron fist, that his ranch hands were all outlaws and half-breeds as broken as he was, and that he communicated more with the crack of a whip than with words. As she crested the final rise, the Blackwood Ranch spread out below her, and Elara felt a tremor of fear that had nothing to do with her exhaustion. It wasn't a home, it was a fortress. The main house was built of dark timber and river stone, low and imposing, with narrow windows that looked like suspicious eyes. A formidable stone wall, impossibly high and thick, encircled the main compound. It was a place designed to keep the world out. Taking a shaky breath, she nudged her weary horse Bess down the winding path. The air grew still, the chirping of insects seeming to die away as she approached the massive iron-strapped wooden gates. There was no one in sight. She dismounted, her legs trembling, and pulled on a thick rope hanging by the gate. A deep, clangorous bell echoed across the yard, a sound that felt like a summons and a warning all at once. Minutes passed. The silence pressed in on her. Just as she was about to ring the bell again, a man emerged from the shadows of the large barn. He was tall and broad-shouldered, moving with a predator's silent grace. His hair was as black as a raven's wing, tied back with a leather cord. His face was all harsh angles and unforgiving lines, his skin tanned to a deep bronze. But it was his eyes that stole the air from her lungs. They were a startling pale grey, like a winter storm over the plains, and they watched her with an unnerving, absolute stillness. He wore dark trousers and a simple grey shirt with a gun belt slung low on his hips. This had to be him. Kalin Blackwood. He stopped 10 feet from the gate, his expression unreadable, his silence a weapon. "What do you want?" His voice was a low rasp, like stones grinding together. It was a voice that hadn't been used for pleasantries in a long time, if ever. Elara's practiced speech died in her throat. She cleared it, forcing herself to stand taller. "My name is Elara Vance. I'm looking for work." A flicker of something disbelief, maybe contempt, crossed his features. He looked from her tired horse to her dust-caked face. "This is a working ranch, not a charity house. We don't hire girls to sweep porches." The dismissive tone stung, but it also ignited a spark of defiance in her. "I'm not a girl," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I can mend fences, muck stalls, tend to livestock, and I can cook and clean better than any man you've got. I grew up on a ranch. I know the work." He took a step closer, his grey eyes narrowing as they scrutinized her. It felt like being weighed and measured by a wolf, deciding if she was prey or simply an annoyance. "The double V. Your father is Thomas Vance." It wasn't a question. She flinched. Of course he knew. In this part of the territory, everyone knew everyone else's business, especially their failures. "He is." He lost it all. Blackwood stated his voice, devoid of sympathy. "And you think you can find salvation here? I'm not looking for salvation," she shot back, her chin high. "I'm looking for a wage. I'll do any job you have, and I'll work harder than anyone on your payroll. That's all." For a long moment, he just stared. The silence stretched thick and heavy. Ilara's heart pounded against her ribs, a frantic drum against the silent judgment of his gaze. She had been warned that he was a cruel, unforgiving man. She could see it now in the hard set of his jaw, in the cold emptiness of his eyes. But beneath the coldness, she saw something else, something she hadn't expected, a profound, aching loneliness. It was there in the way he held himself, a man braced against the world. Just as she was certain he would turn her away, an older woman with a kind, weathered face and silver-streaked black hair, pulled into a neat bun, bustled out of the main house. She wiped her hands on her apron, her dark eyes taking in the scene at the gate. "Kalin, who is this?" The woman asked, her voice warm and melodic, a stark contrast to his grating rasp. Blackwood didn't take his eyes off Ilara. "Trouble." The woman clicked her tongue. "She looks like she's ridden halfway across the territory. Let her in at least for a drink of water." She walked to the gate and gave Ilara a reassuring smile. "I am Maria. I am the housekeeper here." Blackwood's jaw tightened, but he gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. He unlatched the heavy bar on the gate and swung it open just enough for Ilara and Bess to pass through. The screech of the hinges sounded like a final groan of protest. As Ilara led Bess inside, she felt Kalin Blackwood's eyes on her back, a physical weight of scrutiny and suspicion. The yard was meticulously clean, but stark. There were no flowers, no signs of life beyond the necessary functions of a ranch. It was a place of work, not of living. "I'll take the horse," he grunted, taking the reins from her hand. His fingers brushed against hers, and his skin was calloused and unexpectedly warm. For a fleeting second, his stormy eyes met hers, and she saw a flicker of something deep and guarded before the mask of indifference slammed back into place. "Maria," he said, his voice flat. "See if she's of any use in the kitchen. If not, she's gone by morning." Without another word, he turned and led Bess towards the barn, his tall frame disappearing into the shadows. Ilara was left standing in the courtyard of the most feared man in Arizona, with the gate closed firmly behind her. She had gotten in, but as she looked at the stone walls surrounding her, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just walked into a prison. Life at the Blackwood Ranch was a regimen of silent, relentless labor. The sun was the clock, and exhaustion was the only currency. The handful of ranch hands were as quiet and grim as their employer. They were a motley collection of men, a grizzled old-timer named Jed, two young Mexican brothers Mateo and Lucas, and a silent, towering man of unknown origin, everyone just called Silas, all of whom seemed to be running from something. They moved with a purpose that bordered on fear, their eyes constantly flitting towards the main house, towards the inevitable presence of Kalin Blackwood. Kalin, as Ilara soon learned, was not merely a boss, he was a force of nature. He rose before the sun and worked until long after it had set, demanding the same from everyone else. He was a man of brutal efficiency. He spoke only to give orders, his words clipped and sharp. There was no praise, only the absence of criticism. A job done well was met with silence. A mistake was met with a glare from those piercing grey eyes that could freeze a man's blood. Ilara was put under Maria's charge. Her days were a blur of cooking for the hands, cleaning the cavernous and sparsely furnished house, mending clothes, and tending a small vegetable garden Maria fought to keep alive. The house itself felt like a mausoleum. It was clean and orderly, but devoid of any personal touches. There were no paintings on the walls, no rugs on the floors, no books on the shelves. It was the home of a man who didn't live but merely existed. Her direct interactions with Kalin were minimal and tense. He would enter the kitchen for his meals, which he took alone at the large, empty dining table. He would nod curtly at her, his eyes never lingering, and eat in a silence so profound it felt like a physical pressure. Yet Ilara was a keen observer. She started to see things the stories didn't tell. She saw the way his large, calloused hands could be surprisingly gentle when he was checking a horse's hoof for a stone. She saw him one evening, standing by the corral, watching a newly foaled colt with an expression that for a fleeting moment looked like wistful tenderness. She noticed that while he was harsh with his men, he was never unjust. Their wages were fair, their provisions adequate. He worked them to the bone, but he worked himself harder. One afternoon, a slick cattle rustler named Silas Croft rode up to the gates. Croft was everything Kalin was not: gregarious, well-dressed, with a politician's easy smile and cold, calculating eyes. His family owned the sprawling Seabar ranch to the east and had been trying to drive Kalin out for years, using his heritage as a weapon against him in the nearby town of Redemption. Blackwood Croft called out his voice, dripping with false congeniality. "Heard you had some trouble with that creek of yours. Might be willing to buy that northern pasture off you. Save you the trouble." Kalin emerged from the barn, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. He moved with that same deliberate, dangerous calm. "The creek is fine. The pasture's not for sale. You know that, Croft." Croft's smile tightened. "Still playing the lone wolf, eh, Blackwood? A man can't stand alone forever. People in Redemption are talking. They say this land would be better off in civilized hands." The insult was clear, a direct stab at Kalin's Apache blood. Ilara, watching from the kitchen window, saw Kalin's shoulders tense. His hand drifted almost imperceptibly towards the gun on his hip. The air crackled with a silent, violent energy. "Get off my land," Croft Kalin said, his voice lethally low. Or what Croft sneered, "You'll send your band of outcasts after me." "This isn't the old days. The law protects decent folk now. I am the law on this ranch," Kalin replied, his grey eyes turning to chips of ice. "And you've got 10 seconds to obey it before I make you." There was no bluff in his voice. Croft, for all his bluster, seemed to recognize it. With a final hateful glare, he spurred his horse around and galloped away, leaving a cloud of angry dust in his wake. Later that evening, Maria spoke to Ilara as they washed the dinner dishes. "That man Croft, his family, has been a thorn in Kalin's side since his father died." "What happened to his father?" Ilara asked softly, daring to pry into the past that was never spoken of. Maria sighed her hands, stilling in the soapy water. William Blackwood was a hard man, but fair. He fell in love with a Chiricahua woman, Kalin's mother, Anawa. people. They never accepted her. When William was found dead, shot in the back on his own land, it was easier for them to whisper that the savages were to blame. They looked at young Kalin, half Apache himself, and they saw a killer. They blamed him, Ilara whispered, horrified. The sheriff at the time, a friend of the Crofts, held a joke of an investigation. They never found the killer, but the suspicion stuck to Kalin like mud. He was just a boy, barely 16. He had to fight for every inch of this ranch his father left him. The Crofts tried to take it. The town turned its back on him. He built these walls, she said, gesturing to the house around them, both outside and in. He decided if the world was going to treat him like a monster, he would be one. The story settled in Ilara's heart like a stone. The cruelty she had seen was not a natural state. It was a shield, a suit of armor forged in pain and betrayal. She thought of the cold silences at the dinner table, the stark emptiness of the house, the way he kept everyone, including himself, at a distance. He wasn't just a cruel man. He was a deeply wounded one. The next day, she did something bold. When she served him his dinner, instead of retreating immediately to the kitchen, she placed a small, simple jar on the table. In it was a single, defiant, desert marigold she had found growing by the well. Kalin looked from the flower to her, his brow furrowed in confusion. "What is this?" The house needed something, she said simply, her heart hammering. Something alive. He stared at the bright yellow flower for a long time, his expression unreadable. For a moment, she thought he would sweep it from the table, that she had crossed a line that should never have been approached. But he didn't. He just nodded a stiff, jerky motion and began to eat his meal in his customary silence. But something had shifted. The silence was still there, but it felt different. Less like an absence, and more like a space waiting to be filled. The single small flower sat on the vast, empty table, a tiny beacon of warmth in the cold stone fortress of Kalin Blackwood's world. And for the first time, Ilara felt not fear, but a flicker of hope. Autumn bled into early winter, dusting the mountain peaks with a fine layer of white and bringing a biting wind that whistled through the cracks of the bunkhouse. The rhythm of the ranch continued its unyielding pace, but a subtle change was underway, a current of awareness flowing between Ilara and Kalin. He still kept his distance, his words as sparse as trees on the high plains, but his eyes would occasionally find hers across the yard. The single marigold on his table was replaced by another, when it wilted a silent ritual she performed, and he permitted. The cracks in his armor were small, almost imperceptible. One morning, he found her struggling to lift a heavy sack of feed. Before she could protest, he had lifted it, as if it were a feather, and placed it in the storeroom, his only acknowledgement a gruff "don't break your back," before he turned and walked away. Another time, he saw her shivering in the wind while hanging laundry, and the next day a thick, warm wool blanket, clearly old, but well cared for, was left folded on her cot. There was no note, no explanation. None was needed. The true fracture, the one that would shatter his carefully constructed walls, came with the first great storm of the season. It began as a dusting of snow in the afternoon, but by evening, the sky had turned a bruised purple-grey, and a blizzard descended upon the ranch with shocking ferocity. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, and snow fell so thick and fast it erased the world, reducing visibility to mere feet. The men rushed to secure the livestock, their shouts swallowed by the gale. In the midst of the chaos, Mateo, one of the young Mexican brothers, burst into the kitchen, his face pale with panic. "It is the new heifer, the one in the north pasture. She was due to calf, and we cannot find her. The north pasture was the most remote, a wide open space vulnerable to the full force of the storm. To be caught out there was a death sentence. "Stay inside," Kalin ordered everyone, his voice a low command that cut through the wind's shriek. He was already pulling on a heavy buffalo hide coat, his expression grim. "I'll find her." "You can't go alone," Ilara cried, grabbing his arm without thinking. The muscle beneath her fingers was hard as iron. "You'll be lost in minutes." His grey eyes locked onto hers, a storm within the storm. "It's my ranch, my responsibility." But as he turned to leave, Ilara saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes. He was strong, but he wasn't invincible. Before anyone could stop her, she had grabbed her own worn coat and a lantern. "Then I'm coming with you. I know that pasture as well as anyone. 2 sets of eyes are better than 1. "Don't be a fool, woman." He snarled, his fear for her safety manifesting as anger. "The fool is the one who walks into a blizzard alone," she retorted, her chin set stubbornly. "We're wasting time." For a heart-stopping moment, he stared at her, the wind whipping strands of her hair across her face. He saw not foolishness, but a fierce, unyielding strength he hadn't encountered in anyone before. With a frustrated growl, he shoved a heavy scarf into her hands. "Stay close. If I lose you, I won't come looking." It was a lie, and they both knew it. The world outside the stone walls was a maelstrom of white. The wind tore at them, stealing their breath and driving icy needles into any exposed skin. The lantern cast a pathetic, flickering glow that was immediately swallowed by the swirling snow. They fought for every step, Kalin leading the way, his broad back, a dark shape against the blinding white. They found the heifer huddled in a small rocky alcove, a tiny shivering calf lying beside her. The mother was weak, unable to get to her feet. "We have to get them back," Kalin yelled over the wind. "The calf won't survive the hour." He managed to get the mother standing, while Ilara wrapped the newborn calf in her own scarf, tucking it inside her coat to shield it from the wind. It was a slow, agonizing journey back. The snow was deepening, and Ilara, smaller and less accustomed to such brutal conditions, began to falter. Her feet were numb, her strength failing. She stumbled, falling to her knees in the deep snow. Instantly, Kalin was there. He helped her up his face, a mask of grim concern. "Give me the calf," he ordered. He took the small, warm bundle from her, and then, without a word of warning, he scooped her up into his arms. Ilara cried out in protest, mortified. "I can walk. No, you can't," he said, his voice rough but firm. Cradling her against his chest as if she weighed nothing with the calf tucked under his other arm, he began the long, impossible walk back to the safety of the barn. Ilara was pressed against the solid wall of his chest. She could feel the powerful, steady beat of his heart through the thick layers of their coats. She could smell the scent of pine leather and the cold night air clinging to him. In the heart of the raging blizzard, held in the arms of the cruel Apache, she had never felt safer. She buried her face against his shoulder, succumbing to the exhaustion and the strange, overwhelming sense of security. They made it to the barn, the warm, hay-scented air a shocking relief. The other hands rushed to help, taking the heifer and her calf to a warm, dry stall. Kalin set Ilara down gently, but she swayed her legs, refusing to hold her. He caught her, his hands firm on her waist, and led her to a pile of hay. "Maria, get her some hot broth," he commanded, his voice tight with an emotion he couldn't hide. He knelt before her, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he pulled off her frozen, wet boots. He began to chafe her feet, his touch firm and methodical, trying to bring the life back into them. Ilara watched him through a haze of fatigue. His dark hair had fallen across his brow. His face was etched with worry, and the icy mask he always wore was gone, melted away by the heat of the crisis. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice hoarse. He looked up, his pale grey eyes meeting hers. In their depths she saw a maelstrom of emotions, gratitude, fear, and something else, something softer and more vulnerable that he had kept hidden from the world. "You shouldn't have come," he said, his voice low and rough. "And you shouldn't have gone alone," she replied, her gaze unwavering. A long silence fell between them, broken only by the howl of the wind outside and the soft lowing of the cattle. He didn't let go of her foot. His thumb traced a slow, gentle circle over her ankle. It was an absent-minded, unconscious gesture, but to Ilara, it was more intimate than a kiss. In the flickering lantern light of the barn, surrounded by the storm, the walls he had spent a decade building came crashing down. He was no longer Kalin Blackwood, the feared rancher. And she was no longer just his employee. They were two people who had walked through a storm together and found a fragile, unspoken connection in the quiet aftermath. The facade had cracked, and neither of them knew how to piece it back together. The blizzard broke at dawn, leaving the world blanketed in a pristine, silent white. The ranch stirred back to life, but the atmosphere had changed. The unspoken event in the storm had created a new, fragile intimacy between Ilara and Kalin. The ranch hands noticed it in the way his eyes would follow her as she crossed the yard, and the way she no longer flinched when he spoke. The silence between them was now charged with unanswered questions. A few days later, while Ilara was helping Maria knead bread in the warm kitchen, she finally gathered the courage to ask what she had been wondering since the night of the storm. "Maria, why does he stay, Kalin? He has the money. He could sell this place and go anywhere somewhere people wouldn't judge him for his name or his blood." Maria sighed, dusting her hands with flour. She looked out the window towards the barn where Kalin was breaking a wild mustang, a dance of power and patience. "Because this land is all he has left of them. Of his father, and especially of his mother." She gestured for Ilara to sit at the table. Anawa, his mother. She was not like the other women. She was Chiricahua, yes, but she was also a healer. She knew the plants, the old ways. She was gentle and saw beauty in this harsh land. William Blackwood, his father, was a man who respected strength above all, and he saw more strength in her quiet spirit than in any 10 cowboys. He loved her fiercely. Maria's eyes grew distant, lost in memory. This house, it was not always so empty. Anawa filled it with color. She wove beautiful blankets, planted wildflowers by the porch. She would sing in her own language. And Kalin, as a boy, he was not like he is now. He was quiet, yes, but he had his mother's smile and his father's determination. He was caught between two worlds, but they made a world for him here. The story painted a picture so different from the stark reality of the ranch that Ilara could barely imagine it. The trouble started when William began buying up more land. Maria continued, her voice low. The Crofts, Silas's father in particular, wanted it. They saw William's marriage to Anawa as a weakness, an insult. They started the rumors calling her a squaw, whispering that she used witchcraft on him. The town Redemption, it followed their lead. They were shunned. Then, his father's death, Ilara prompted gently. Maria's face hardened. It was an ambush, shot from a distance. The sheriff, Bartholomew Jones, was a good friend of the Croft family. He asked a few questions, declared it the work of renegade Apaches, and closed the case. But everyone knew who the real renegades were. Kalin was 16. He found his father's body. The day of the funeral, Croft Sr. came here with an offer to buy the ranch for pennies, on the dollar, to save the boy from the burden. Ilara gasped, imagining the horror of it. Kalin threw him off the property. From that day on, he was alone. His mother. Her heart broke. The whispers in town grew uglier now, directed at Kalin. They called him the half-breed killer. They said he was just like his kind. Anawa grew sick with grief and sorrow. She faded away within the year. Kalin buried her himself, up on that ridge, overlooking the valley next to his father. Maria looked at Ilara, her eyes filled with a deep sadness. He was 16 years old, and he had lost everything. The town that should have helped him condemned him. The neighbors who should have supported him tried to steal from him. So he tore out the flowers, took down the blankets, and locked the door on his heart. He became the monster they all said he was, because it was the only way he knew how to survive. This ranch is his penance, his fortress, and his last connection to the love he was so cruelly denied. The pieces clicked into place, forming a portrait of unimaginable pain. The high stone walls weren't just to keep Croft out. They were to keep a world that had betrayed him at bay. His cruelty was a shield, his silence a defense against ever being that vulnerable again. Later that day, Ilara found Kalin by the corral, his work with the mustang finished. The horse stood tired but submissive, nuzzling his hand. He was stroking its neck, his expression unguarded and weary. "She was a beautiful horse," Ilara said softly, approaching slowly so as not to startle him. He didn't turn, but his hand stilled on the horse's mane. "She's spirited. Needs a firm hand, but a fair one. Like her owner." The words were out before she could stop them. He turned, then his grey eyes searching her face. He saw no judgment there, only a profound, empathetic sorrow. "What did Maria tell you?" he asked, his voice rough. "Enough," she said, quietly. "She told me about your mother, about the flowers." His jaw tightened, a muscle feathering along its line. He turned away, staring out at the distant mountains. That was a long time ago. Love doesn't die just because a person does, Kalin. She used his name for the first time, and it hung in the air between them, a fragile and powerful thing. He flinched as if struck. He took a step away then, another putting distance between them. "You don't know anything. I know what it's like to be on the verge of losing everything," she said, her voice trembling slightly but full of conviction. "And I know that shutting the world out doesn't stop the pain. It just makes the house colder." He spun around, his eyes blazing with a decade of suppressed grief and fury. "And what would you have me do? Invite the town in for tea? Let Croft have the land my father bled for? They see an Apache, a savage. Nothing I do will ever change that." "I don't," she whispered, taking a step towards him. "When I look at you, I don't see that. I see a man who walked into a blizzard to save a calf. A man who protects those under his care, even if he does it with a scowl. I see a man who has carried a burden too heavy for anyone to bear alone." Her words struck him like a physical blow. No one had ever defended him. No one had ever claimed to see past the monster. He stared at her, his chest heaving, his defenses completely shattered. The pain in his eyes was so raw, so deep it was a physical wound. He took a ragged breath, the sound of a man drowning. He wanted to push her away, to retreat back into the safety of his anger. But he couldn't. Her gaze held him, offering not pity but understanding, a validation he had starved for his entire adult life. Slowly, as if moving against a powerful current, he closed the distance between them. He raised a trembling hand and gently, tentatively touched her face, his calloused thumb tracing the line of her cheek. The gesture was one of awe and disbelief, as if he were touching a ghost. "Ilara," he breathed, his voice breaking on her name. And in that one word, in that single hesitant touch, the past was no longer a locked room. The door had been opened, and the ghosts of his parents, the pain of his youth, and the hope he thought long dead, all came flooding out into the light. The confession in the corral changed everything. The unspoken tension between Kalin and Ilara blossomed into a quiet, tentative romance. It was a love story, told not in grand declarations, but in small, meaningful moments. It was in the way he would leave a freshly picked wildflower on the kitchen windowsill for her each morning. It was in the lingering touches as he took a plate from her hand. It was in the long, silent walks they took along the ridge at sunset, where he would show her the graves of his parents, finally sharing his deepest grief. He began to talk, not much at first, but the words came. He told her about his mother's teachings about the names of the stars in the Apache language. He told her about his father's dream of building a ranch that would last for generations. With every shared memory, another layer of his hardened exterior peeled away, revealing the intelligent, passionate, and deeply wounded man beneath. Ilara, in turn, told him of her own family, of her hopes and fears for her ailing father. They found a common ground in their shared love for the land and their fierce loyalty to family. The change in Kalin was not lost on the ranch hands. The oppressive silence of the ranch was replaced by a low hum of activity that felt less driven by fear and more by shared purpose. Kalin even shared a rare, small smile when Lucas, the younger of the two brothers, successfully roped a particularly difficult steer. The stone fortress was slowly, painstakingly becoming a home. But their fragile peace was not destined to last. Silas Croft had been watching. He saw the new life at the Blackwood ranch, saw the way Kalin no longer looked like a man haunted by ghosts, and it filled him with a venomous rage. The Blackwood land and its precious water rights from the San Pedro River were a prize the Croft family had coveted for a generation. Croft saw Kalin's newfound happiness not as a healing, but as a weakness to be exploited. The trouble started small. A section of fence along the northern pasture was cut, and a dozen head of cattle went missing. Kalin and his men spent 2 days tracking them, finally finding them miles away, scattered and stressed. There was no proof it was Croft, but Kalin knew. A week later, the flow of the creek that fed Kalin's main watering troughs slowed to a trickle. Kalin rode upstream and found what he expected, a crudely built dam of rocks and logs on Croft's property, illegally diverting the water. Armed with a copy of his father's deed and its explicit water rights, Kalin rode into the town of Redemption to see the sheriff. The new sheriff, a man named John Harding, was younger than his predecessor and reputed to be a fair man. However, he was also cautious. "I hear you, Blackwood," Harding said, leaning back in his chair, the tin star on his chest gleaming. "But all I see is a pile of rocks. Croft claims it's for erosion control. Without witnesses, it's your word against his. And you know how this town feels about Silas Croft versus you. The old prejudice was still there, a wall Kalin couldn't seem to break down. He left the sheriff's office with a familiar bitter taste in his mouth. He and his men had to spend a full day dismantling the dam themselves, a back-breaking task that left them exhausted and angry. The final escalation came in the form of a direct threat to Ilara. She had ridden into Redemption for supplies the first time she had left the ranch in months. As she was loading sacks of flour into the wagon, Silas Croft and 2 of his hired thugs cornered her in the alley beside the general store. Well, look what we have here," Croft sneered, blocking her exit. "The Apache's little pet. Tell me what's it like, living with a half-breed killer. Does he howl at the moon?" Ilara's heart pounded, but she refused to show fear. "I don't know who you're talking about," she said, her voice cold. "The man I work for is a better man than you will ever be." Croft's smile vanished. He stepped closer, his shadow falling over her. "He's got you fooled, little girl. That land he's on, it's built on blood. My family should have had it years ago. Maybe it's time we corrected that mistake." He reached out and grabbed her arm, his fingers digging in painfully. "You need to tell your master that he's running out of time. He can sign the deed over to me and walk away, or he can watch everything he cares about turn to ash. Starting with you." Suddenly a voice cut through the tension. "Let her go, Croft." It was Sheriff Harding. He had been coming out of the saloon across the street and had seen the confrontation. His hand was resting on the butt of his pistol. Croft's men tensed, but Croft just laughed, releasing Ilara's arm. "Just a friendly chat, Sheriff, welcoming the lady to town." He tipped his hat to Ilara with mock politeness. "You deliver my message." With a final menacing glare, he and his men sauntered away. Harding walked over to Ilara, his expression serious. "Are you all right, Miss Vance?" "I'm fine," she said, though she was shaking. "Thank you, Sheriff." "Croft is a snake," Harding said, his eyes following him down the street. "But he's a careful one. This is getting bolder. You be careful." When Ilara returned to the ranch and told Kalin what had happened, she saw a look on his face she had never seen before, a cold, terrifying fury that eclipsed all his past harshness, the rage of a man protecting something precious. He went to the gun cabinet in his father's old study, a room Ilara had never seen him enter, and took out a gleaming Winchester rifle. "Kalin, what are you going to do?" she asked, her voice filled with dread. "This ends now," he said, his voice a low growl. "He threatened you. He crossed a line." "Don't," she pleaded, grabbing his arm. "Don't become the man they all say you are. That's what he wants. He wants you to do something rash, something the sheriff can't ignore. Please, let's think." He stared down at her, his jaw clenched so tight it looked like it might crack. He was vibrating with the need for violent retribution. But as he looked into her pleading eyes, he saw the wisdom in her words. A direct confrontation would only play into Croft's hands. "He won't stop, Ilara," Kalin said, his voice raw. "He will keep coming until he takes everything." "Then we won't let him," she replied, her own resolve hardening. "We have Maria and the men. They are loyal to you. We are not just you against him anymore. We are a family, and we will protect our home." He looked from her determined face to the loyal men gathering in the yard, drawn by the tension. For the first time, he wasn't the lone wolf fighting for his territory. He was the head of a family, a clan ready to defend their own. The storm Croft had been brewing was no longer just a threat. It was about to break, and Kalin knew he would not be facing it alone. The ranch became a fortified camp. Kalin organized watches with 2 men patrolling the perimeter at all hours. The calm, domestic atmosphere was replaced by a tense, vigilant waiting. Kalin was a coiled spring, his every sense on high alert. He barely slept, and the rare moments of peace he and Ilara had shared were now fraught with the shadow of Croft's threat. The attack came not with a frontal assault, but with fire. One moonless night, a frantic shout of fire shattered the darkness. Ilara's heart leaped into her throat. Rushing outside, she saw a horrifying sight. The massive hay barn, the one filled with the winter feed for the entire herd, was engulfed in flames. The fire was raging with an unnatural speed, the dry hay acting as a perfect fuel. "It's a diversion," Kalin roared, his mind working instantly. While the hands armed with buckets fought a losing battle against the inferno, Kalin grabbed Ilara. "Stay in the house. Lock the doors, Maria, with her." His eyes were wild with fear, not for the barn, but for her. He knew this was a ploy to draw them all out. But before he could organize a defense of the main compound, 3 riders burst from the shadows Silas Croft and his 2 thugs. They were riding hard not for the fire, but straight for the house. Kalin shoved Ilara towards the porch. "Go now!" He drew his pistol, turning to face them, a lone figure against the hellish orange glow of the fire. But Croft wasn't interested in a gunfight. In a move of shocking speed, one of his men veered, leaning low from the saddle and snatching a terrified Ilara from the porch steps. She screamed, her cry swallowed by the roar of the flames. No, Kalin's shout was a sound of pure agony. He fired, but the rider was already galloping away, using Ilara as a shield. The deed Blackwood Croft yelled, reining in his horse a safe distance away. "The old Miller cabin by sunrise. You come alone with the deed signed over to me, or she dies. And don't even think about bringing the sheriff." With that, they were gone, disappearing into the darkness, leaving Kalin standing alone amidst the ruins of his barn and the ashes of his hopes. The fire meant nothing. The cattle meant nothing. They had taken Ilara. A primal rage, cold and absolute, washed over him. The civilized man that Ilara had so carefully coaxed out of the darkness vanished, replaced by the predator he had been forced to become years ago. The skills he had learned from his mother's people, the tracking, the silent movement, the relentless focus of a hunter, it all came rushing back. He turned to his stunned ranch hands. "Jed, ride for Sheriff Harding. Don't kill your horse, but don't spare it either. Tell him what happened. Tell him Croft has her at the old Miller cabin." He then looked at Mateo and Lucas. "Get the horses. We're not waiting for the law." As the men scrambled to follow his orders, Kalin went back into the house. He ignored the rifle instead, going to a heavy locked chest at the foot of his bed, a chest he hadn't opened in 15 years. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was his mother's hunting knife and his father's matched set of Colt peacemakers, their ivory handles worn smooth. He strapped on the gun belt. He was no longer just a rancher defending his land. He was a son avenging his parents and a man fighting for the woman who had given him back his soul. The old Miller cabin was a dilapidated structure in a box canyon miles from the ranch, a perfect place for an ambush. Kalin, Mateo, and Lucas tethered their horses a mile out and proceeded on foot, moving like wraiths through the pre-dawn gloom. Kalin's Apache blood sang in his veins. He saw the snapped twigs, the disturbed stones. The trail was clear to him. He could smell the smoke from their campfire. He left the brothers on the ridge with rifles, giving them clear instructions. "Do not fire unless I am down. Your job is to keep their heads low. This is my fight." He circled around, climbing the treacherous rock face at the back of the canyon, moving with a silent agility that would have terrified anyone who saw him. He reached a ledge directly above the cabin, just as the first hint of grey light touched the eastern sky. Below, Croft and his men were clustered around a small fire. Ilara was tied to a chair inside the cabin, visible through the open doorway. She was unharmed, but her face was pale and defiant. "He's not coming," one of the thugs grumbled. "He'll go to the law." "He'll come," Croft said with certainty. "I know his kind. Pride and fury. He'll come." At that moment, Kalin dropped from the ledge landing as silently as a mountain cat behind the 2 thugs. Before they could react, he moved with blinding speed. The butt of his pistol cracked against the back of one man's skull, and a swift, brutal kick sent the other sprawling into the fire. Croft spun around his face, a mask of shock, fumbling for his gun. But Kalin was already on him, a whirlwind of righteous fury. He slammed Croft against the cabin wall, the wood groaning in protest. The gun flew from Croft's hand. "Where is she?" Kalin's voice was a deadly whisper. Croft, panicked, tried to sneer. "You're too late, half-breed." It was the last mistake he would ever make. Kalin's rage, held in check for a lifetime, exploded. He drove his fist into Croft's face, a sharp crack echoing in the silent canyon. As Croft crumpled, Kalin rushed into the cabin, his mother's knife already in his hand. He sliced through the ropes, binding Elara, his hands, gentle despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "Kalin," she cried, throwing her arms around him. He held her for only a second. "Stay here." He emerged from the cabin, just as Croft was staggering to his feet, blood streaming from his nose. Croft's face was twisted with hatred. "This changes nothing. The town will still see you as a savage. Let them," Kalin said, his voice flat and cold. He raised his pistol, the barrel aimed squarely at Croft's heart. The sound of approaching horses stopped him. Sheriff Harding, led by Jed, arrived with a posse of 4 deputies, their guns drawn. "Drop it!" Blackwood Harding yelled, though his gun was aimed at Croft. For a long, tense moment, Kalin stood his ground. The desire for final vengeance, warring with the future Elara had shown him, was possible. He looked at Elara standing in the doorway of the cabin, her eyes pleading with him. He took a deep, shuddering breath and slowly, deliberately lowered his pistol. He set fire to my barn. He kidnapped Miss Vance. Kalin said, his voice steady. "His man over there," he gestured to the thug who had stumbled from the fire, now nursing a burned hand, "will testify if you persuade him." Harding looked at the scene, the burned-out thug, the unconscious one, Croft's bloodied face, and the cut ropes by Elara's feet. The story was clear. "Silas Croft, the sheriff," said his voice, ringing with authority. "You're under arrest, for arson, for kidnapping. And we'll also have a look into the death of William Blackwood." A flicker of pure terror crossed Croft's face. The old crime, the one that had started it all, was finally coming into the light. As the deputies hauled a protesting Croft and his men away, Kalin finally went to Elara, pulling her into his arms. He held her tightly, burying his face in her hair, breathing in her scent, as if to reassure himself she was real. The confrontation was over. The battle had been won, not with the final fatal shot he had so desperately wanted to take, but with the choice to be the man she believed him to be. The arrest of Silas Croft sent shockwaves through the town of Redemption. Under Sheriff Harding's intense questioning, one of Croft's hired men confessed everything, not just the fire and the kidnapping, but years of rustling and intimidation, all on Croft's orders. The most damning revelation came when the man admitted to hearing Croft brag about how his father had taken care of William Blackwood years ago, finally giving Harding the leverage he needed to reopen the old murder case. The Croft empire, built on greed and prejudice, began to crumble. Back at the ranch, a sense of profound peace settled over the land. The burned-out shell of the barn stood as a scar, but it was a scar, not a mortal wound. The ranch hands, led by Jed and the brothers, began the arduous task of clearing the debris and planning to rebuild, working with a newfound sense of ownership and pride. They were no longer just employees of a feared man. They were defenders of a home. But the true healing was happening within the stone walls of the main house. The confrontation had purged the last of the poison from Kalin's soul. The rage that had defined him for 15 years was gone, replaced by a deep, quiet love for Elara. The emptiness of the house began to recede as their life together filled it. One evening Elara came into the study to find Kalin staring at a small, dusty box. He opened it, revealing a collection of faded photographs and a beautifully beaded leather pouch. "My mother's," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He pulled out a photograph of a smiling, handsome man with his arm around a beautiful, dark-eyed woman. "My parents, on their wedding day." He then opened the pouch and poured its contents into his hand, a handful of dried, pressed wildflowers. She loved wildflowers, he whispered. She said they were tougher than they looked, able to find life in the hardest of places. He looked at Ilara, his stormy grey eyes clear and filled with an emotion so powerful it made her breath catch. Like you. She took his hand, her fingers lacing with his. You rebuilt the walls of this ranch to keep the world out, Kalin. But now we can give them a new purpose. Not to keep people out, but to keep our family safe within. And that is what they did. Kalin sent for Ilara's father, bringing him to the ranch, where the clean, dry air and Maria's care began to work a slow magic on his failing health. He found a quiet joy in watching his daughter, who he thought he had failed blossom, with a happiness he had never seen in her. The town of redemption began to change too. Seeing the truth of the Croft legacy, many felt a collective shame for their treatment of Kalin. People who had once crossed the street to avoid him now offered a hesitant nod. Sheriff Harding became a regular visitor, not on official business, but for a cup of coffee, his presence a public endorsement that washed away the stain of old suspicions. One spring afternoon, a year after Ilara had first ridden through the gates, she and Kalin stood on the ridge overlooking the valley by the two simple graves of his parents. The new barn stood proud and strong in the distance, and the sound of laughter from the ranch hands drifted up on the breeze. Kalin had his arm around her, holding her close. He had placed a fresh bouquet of desert marigolds on his mother's grave. I used to come up here and feel nothing but anger, he said, quietly, his gaze sweeping over the land that was his heritage. This land felt like a curse, a constant reminder of what I had lost. He turned to her, cupping her face in his hands. You made it a home again, Ilara. You looked at the cruel Apache everyone saw, and you found me. You healed a heart I thought was long dead. It was never dead, Kalin, she replied, her own eyes shining with tears. It was just hidden, waiting for someone to be brave enough to look. He lowered his head and kissed her a kiss that was not filled with the desperate passion of their first moments, but with the deep, enduring promise of a lifetime. It was a promise of shared sunrises, of hardships faced together, of a future built not on the ashes of a painful past, but on the resilient, unshakable foundation of their love. The world might once have called him the cruel Apache, but standing there with his heart finally healed and his home finally whole, he was simply Kalin. And he was hers. We've just witnessed the incredible journey of Ilara and Kalin, a testament to the idea that love is not about finding a perfect person, but about seeing an imperfect person perfectly. Their story teaches us that behind the highest walls of anger and fear often lie the deepest wounds, and that sometimes all it takes is one person with enough courage and compassion to begin the healing. It's a powerful reminder that everyone has a past, but it's the love we find in the present that defines our future. If this story of a love that healed the deepest wounds and proved that true strength lies in vulnerability touched your heart, please take a moment to show your support. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who loves a story of redemption, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel for more tales of resilience and unexpected love. Thank you for listening.